wrath, rage, war, violence, courage, disrespect, fate, destiny, heroism, vengeance. These are the themes that you're going to find in Homer's Iliad. This is the first reading in our second year of the Great Books reading plan from Great Books of the Western World. I'm Jim. This is Great Books, Big Ideas, and I'll hope you join me on this brief introduction to one of the great epic poems ever written, the Iliad of Homer. The Iliad is a Greek epic poem attributed to the poet Homer. It is a story about the war between the Greeks, who are usually referred to as the Achaeans in the poem, and the Trojans. Specifically, it is about the rage or wrath of Achilles, stemming from an incident in the 10th year of the Trojan War. The Achaeans had laid siege to Troy, and this long epic poem is not a chronicle of the entire war. It has a very limited narrative scope. It is focused on the cause of Achilles' wrath and the consequences of that rage. The plot starts as follows. It begins over the dispute over a woman. The chief general of the Achaeans is Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus. And Agamemnon refuses to ransom the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo, who is on the side of the Trojans. Chryses, the father, appeals to Apollo for help with this matter. Apollo sends a plague upon the Greek forces, and Achilles, who is the general of the Myrmidons, he's the greatest of the Greek warriors. He summons a meeting. The prophet Calchas tells them that they must give up the girl to Chryses to lift the plague from the soldiers. Agamemnon is resentful about being forced to give in, and he demands compensation. So he takes the girl named Briseis, who was seized as booty, and he takes that is Achilles' girl. So this enrages Achilles. He feels like his rights have been violated. He has a right to Briseis, and he almost kills Agamemnon, and then he threatens to leave for home. So what happens when your greatest warrior goes on strike? Achilles asks his mother, Thetis, for help to intercede on his behalf with Zeus, and he asks for Zeus to defeat the Achaeans, his own side, so that they realized just how much they need him. Achilles has a little bit of an ego. Over the objections of Hera, Zeus's wife, Zeus directs the action, and the Trojans get the upper hand in battle. And the leader, the great warrior of the Trojan forces, who's a major character in this book, is Hector. And he is the son of King Priam of Troy and the brother of Paris, who was the cause of this whole mess, because Paris was the man who stole Menelaus' wife, Helen, and took her to Troy, and the Greeks have come to get her back. But anyway, Hector pushes the Greeks back to their ships, where they are forced to entrench and build a protective wall. Agamemnon is urged to persuade Achilles to return to the field of battle. Achilles refuses the offer of riches and a daughter in marriage, though he does agree to stick around a while longer. The Trojans press ever closer to victory, and most of the Achaean warriors, the chieftains, are wounded. Then we have a plot twist. Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, pleads with Achilles to re-enter the war. Achilles still refuses, but he does allow Patroclus to don Achilles' armor and go into battle. This is a bad idea. At the sight of Achilles, remember he's wearing Achilles' armor, the Trojans are forced to retreat. But Patroclus is killed by Apollo and Hector, who strips the armor from Patroclus and puts it on himself. Now we have the rage of Achilles. The rage is poured on Hector. Achilles makes peace with Agamemnon. He gets a new suit of armor, a shield. He returns to battle, where he proceeds to mow down the Trojan forces one by one. And he kills Hector, lashes his body to his chariot, and drags it to his tent, leaving it unburied, which was very sacrilegious. Then a grand funeral is held for Patroclus, his beloved friend, followed by funeral games or athletic contests and human sacrifice. Achilles drags Hector's body around, still going around unburied, dragging him around the walls of Troy. But the gods protect the corpse from decimation and decay. As usual in this book, the gods are meddling all the time. Then a message is sent from Achilles' mother, Thetis, that Achilles should ransom Hector to King Priam. Notice, by the way, the framing of the ransoming from the beginning to the end. And Priam unexpectedly and very courageously shows up at night in the midst of the Greek camp to plead for the body of his son. Achilles thinks of his own impending death. He has been fated to die in battle. This is where we get the Achilles heel from, his one vulnerable spot. He doesn't die in this book, but he knows it's going to happen at some point. It's been prophesied. And he thinks about his own father, and his wrath finally abates. He and Priam weep together in, for my money, the most touching scene in the whole book. And he eventually gives Hector's body back to Priam and allows him safe passage back to Troy. That is essentially what the book is about. It's a war epic. The epic in the original ancient Greek language runs to nearly 16,000 lines of hexameter verse. That's 6 feet per line. It was probably written in the late 8th to early 7th century BCE. As far as the author, Homer, we hear many traditions, but few reliable facts. It is said that Homer lived around the 9th century BCE, roughly, and about 140 years after the historical Trojan War took place, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1200 BCE. It is said that Homer was blind, and it was assumed that he was a writer. Many theories of the production of this epic poem have been proposed. And remember, also the Odyssey is attributed to Homer as well. Some thought that Homer was illiterate and probably left behind shorter ballad-length poems that much later were collated into the text that we have today. Others thought that the Iliad was a collectively written book, and no one author could have written it himself. Others thought that the poem was one long, cohesive poem, originally composed orally and transmitted via memory, and that over the years, additions were made, making it even longer. Linguistic and historical analysis of the book offered more insights, but did not settle the matter of who wrote the Iliad and when. In the 20th century, critics began looking closely at the literary qualities of the poem, and in it they found much artistry, an amazing unity, corresponding structures, a coherent architecture, and this all suggests that the poem may have been written by one person. The scholar Milman Parry showed that Homer had inherited a tradition of oral epic poetry that made use of epithets. These are like literary hashtags, little shorthand labels, mnemonic devices. And these mnemonic devices were used by oral poets to help them remember these vastly long poems. And the fact that it's written in meter helps with memory as well. And the epithets give the poets lots of metrical flexibility. They can substitute names with epithets to suit the needs of the meter. And they are also kind of like the basis for improvisation. So you've got their anchor points with the epithets, and then the oral poets could improvise off of that. And this scholar studied existing oral poets in Yugoslavia in the 20th century, which bore out these theories. So there were still poets in Yugoslavia who had committed the really long poems to memory. So it seems that Homer was probably an author at the end of a long line of oral bards who improvise a story along a relatively fixed outline, the storyline. And it's probable because Homer's emergence coincides with the emergence of alphabetic writing in Greece. It's probable that Homer used the new technology of writing to compose this poem on an epic scale, and that's at the point at which I like to think that he brought all his artistry to it. I like to think that Homer was a real person, and I can't prove that. But if Homer was the real writer of the Iliad, he's inheriting an oral tradition, and he's molding it into writing and giving it this classic structure. You may wonder whether there really was a Trojan War, and apparently there really was, although there was doubt about that until the 19th century. You can actually visit the remains of Troy today. It was discovered in the 19th century by Heinrich Schliemann, who used the Iliad as a source for geographic clues to the location of the site. Now, I don't think that's a fully settled matter, whether this is the Troy. This is very murky stuff, but something happened at this place, and it's clear that they went through some things in Troy, the site known as Troy. The Achaean forces were actually a confederation of Greek city-states, so not a nation in our own sense of the term. And these city-states were always at war with one another, but they did form alliances, and these alliances could shift. We don't know the historical cause of the Trojan War, but in the mythology of the epic, the cause is clear. As I said, Helen, known as the most beautiful woman on the planet, was the wife of Menelaus of Lacedaemon, and who was the brother of the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon. And Helen ran away from her husband with Paris, the son of King Priam of Troy. So they went to war for a woman to bring her back. Now, this is very much a poem about war, the experience of war, what war does to people. And it has a mixed view of that theme. It presents the sheer carnage of war very vividly, perhaps more vividly than any other story about war you're likely to read. It is gory. It spares no details. It demonstrates the cruelty of war, the savagery of war, the passions, the anger, the violence, and the suffering it causes. War in the Iliad is indeed hell. At the same time, it's a celebration of war. The heroism, the valor, the courage, the passions associated with service and loyalty to your men and to your city-state, to your cause. So it's a paradoxical vision. War is indeed hellish, and yet it's glorious, a terrible beauty, as Yeats might put it. So war is a major theme in the poem. Also, force is another theme in the poem. More on that in a bit. Divine presences are a theme in the poem. The gods, as I said, are very meddlesome. These are anthropomorphic gods. They take sides. They've got axes to grind. They have their own alliances, their own rage and wrath and disputes, and they really complicate matters a lot. So it's also a war between the gods. I think to our modern minds, sometimes this doesn't make a lot of sense, but if to try to grasp the Greek notion of divinity, we might be helped by thinking of the gods as manifestations of human forces, passions, will. But think of the word force or forces. You have you're driven by a certain passion or a willfulness or some force inside of you that's leading you to do something. That's the gods at work. So just as your passions can be in conflict, we're complicated creatures. We might have conflicting forces pulling us this way and that. In the same sense, the gods are in conflict with one another. So, how do you read the Iliad successfully? Well, first of all, what's with all the names? They have multiple names for people and so forth. Yes, it's very confusing. You're going to need a scorecard to keep track. Don't be afraid of consulting some notes in a good edition of the Iliad. But keep in mind that the characters can go by more than one name. So Agamemnon, for instance, has a patronymic name, Atrides, too. So, when you see Atrides, you got to think, oh, that's actually Agamemnon they're talking about. But then it gets even more confusing because Menelaus, who's the brother of Agamemnon, he also has the patronym Atrides because they have the same father. So there's nothing we can really do about this confusion other than to look up names until we get used to them. Use your context clues. It's one of the challenges of reading Homer. Similarly, the epic is filled with a lot of place names, geographical names. There may be maps in your edition of the Iliad that are helpful. You can always consult maps online. There's no shortage of resources out there. And a good edition of the Iliad will have a glossary with these place names to help you keep your place. The poem really revels in sharing these detailed place names. It's almost like a celebration of the Greek world, the Greek environment. As a reader, you should attune yourself to some features of Homer's style. So one we've mentioned already, and that is the epithets, the Homeric epithets, these labels, the rosy-fingered dawn, from the Odyssey, right, that kind of thing. They're usually level modifiers that describe a person or a place or a thing. Another feature to get used to is known as the Homeric simile. A simile is simply a metaphorical comparison. It's also known as the epic simile or an extended simile. These are long comparisons. Usually whatever's being described is being compared to some feature of the natural world, like a waterfall or a storm or something along those lines. And it's used to figuratively show you what's going on. And there's a lot of great descriptive passages in these epic similes, and they add a lot of color and texture to the poem. Another feature of the style is the in media res beginning. In media res is Latin for in the midst of things, in the middle of the thing. It's a common feature of classical epics. They begin in the middle of the plot line. You're just kind of dumped into the action. And this is a sophisticated narrative technique. It doesn't rely on background reporting. It just kind of brings immediacy to the story. So when the Iliad begins, the Greeks have already been fighting at Troy for 9 long years, and the initial source of conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles is over the plunder from battles that have transpired before our story began. So you might ask yourself, like, why is the narrative open with this ransom scene, where Chryses is begging Agamemnon for his daughter? Well, remember what we said about the end with the ransom scene with Achilles and King Priam? That might give you a clue. There's artistic structure going on here. I also would suggest to you that a lot of the narrative techniques that you find in the Iliad and the Odyssey and other epic poems, these are still used today. They're used in novel writing all the time. They're used in plays. They're used in film, especially. Like, you can learn a lot about how to write a story by reading Homer. No doubt about that. Here's some questions for discussion, or you might want to write about them, journal about them. One would be focusing on the wrath of Achilles, the rage of Achilles. I like the word rage. That appears in the Robert Fagel's translation, because we think of road rage. People are always raging, rage tweeting. Rage is in vogue in our sorry society, isn't it? Well, is Achilles' anger, his rage, a virtue or a vice, as presented in the Iliad? You could try to just analyze the ups and downs of that emotion as you course through the story. And you could also look at how rage applies to other characters in the Iliad. He's not the only one, but he is our main focus here, the great hero, great warrior, Achilles. And I always think of he's such a human personality, even though he's larger than life. And when I would teach this to students, I would often try to make an analogy to like sports stars, who are on the field of battle, as it were. Well, have you ever seen an athlete, a star athlete, who held out, who wouldn't show up at camp, or they get very pouty and they make trouble? That's Achilles, right? Achilles is just doing that in a war context, but big name athletes do this all the time. They have big egos, they get full of themselves, they're easily offended, and they will often pout about it, and they will also express rage in their play. So that is something that can make the work a little more accessible. You could also think about the theme of war and try to speculate or discuss whether you think of this as a pro-war or an anti-war poem. The true answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but I often like to think about the Iliad as a great anti-war poem. It shows you the cost of war, the absolute carnage that it wields, the tragedy of it, the absurdity of it, people dying for who, for what. In a lot of ways, I think the Iliad is about that. And in the midst of that, there's great courage, heroism, great deeds. But again, I come back to for who, for what. Have you ever felt wrath or rage? Why not use the Iliad as a lens to examine yourself, your own forces that are at war with one another? And what were the after effects of that wrath and rage? Was there anything about Achilles' wrath that was justified? Does he have a case? Should he sit out? Should he ever have gone back into battle? Why did he give his armor to Patroclus when that was such a bad idea? Yeah, there's a lot of psychoanalysis you can do of Achilles' character and Agamemnon's character and the disagreements between those two giant egos. What is their problem? You might wonder. Why do the gods take sides in the Iliad? Why do they meddle so much in human affairs? And how might modern audiences interpret their behavior? As I suggested before, it might help to just think of the gods as forces, as manifestation of human forces. They just kind of make concrete what's going on inside of us in the world of feeling and emotion. You know, when emotions are driving actions, bad things can happen. Hector, too, is worth consideration. He is one of my favorite characters in the whole poem, perhaps my favorite character, because he also knows, he has a good sense of what his fate is going to be. He's very heroic. He's kind of gotten dragged into this war because his brother ran off with Helen back to Troy, causing the whole thing. You know, he's a great leader of his troops. He's great in battle, but he's not number one. He knows that Achilles is the superior warrior, and yet he faces him knowing he's probably going to be killed. A very deep, rich character is Hector. So those are just a few pointers, a few lines you can pursue when reading this great, great, great epic. You know, the Odyssey as an epic is probably an easier starting point for most readers who are new to Homer. What a great story that is. I'm currently rereading it. But the Iliad is no slouch. The narrative condensation in the Iliad, the raw human emotions, it's all there. It's all there to be savored, to be thought about. And it is a great story. It really is. It's a great human drama. It's filled with great speeches, lots of sort of dramatic speeches back and forth, great descriptive passages. Got all the blood and gore you could want if you're into that kind of thing. But it's got a lot of pathos too. That is the Iliad. I hope you benefited from that in some small way. Would always like to hear your comments down below if you have thoughts or questions. But let us move on to stage number 2 in our year 2 reading plan. Next up is the Greek dramatic poet Aeschylus, and 3 plays by him are a trilogy: Agamemnon, Libation Bearers, and Eumenides. This is known as the Oresteia. It is a don't miss it trilogy of plays, and it continues now. What happened to Agamemnon after the Trojan War? Didn't turn out so well. I'll leave you hanging on that, and talk to you again very soon. Thanks for watching.